Right now, we're excited to have our next guest join us. He's Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He was pushed out of the New York Times for telling the truth about the Iraq War. He's the columnist at SheerPost.com and the author of many best-selling books, including the most recent America, the Farewell Tour, which we covered here on this show. He's one of the most important voices in contemporary journalism. It's Chris Hedges. Hi, Chris. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, Jimmy. Thanks.
So let me just get your breakdown of was it just racism, or was it just people getting the election results wrong? What was the cause of the Capitol siege, and what does it say about our culture?
Well, I mean, the reaction by CNN and the mainstream media I found quite frightening, because all they did was demonize the people in the crowd, which isn't in any way to condone what they did. But unless we investigate the roots of this rage, the rupture of these social bonds, the deep betrayal, then these divisions and the rage that comes with it is only going to grow. I'm actually one of the people who have been very vocal. I was on Democracy Now! Yesterday saying that we should not have deleted Trump from Twitter and other social media platforms, that giving these tech companies that kind of ability to censor is very dangerous. And of course, we have to remember that the first organization they went after was WikiLeaks, blocking their ability to accept donations, using algorithms to essentially drive them off the internet. WikiLeaks would hold press conferences and nobody could get in, or they would use electronic interference. That's the future. And these organizations are utterly opaque. We know nothing about them. They know everything about us, and they are bonded at the hip to the Democratic Party establishment. I find the response of the Democratic Party very, very frightening. Since 2006, they have refused to look at what the sociologist Emil Durkheim would call this anomie, this malaise. This anomie it means these rupturing of social bonds, which have resulted from neoliberalism and austerity and offshoring and all the things we've talked about on this show many times. Instead, it's demonization, and that's all they did. If you turned on CNN, it was thugs and this and that, and that is widening the divide, exacerbating the anger and the rage, and essentially renting the social fabric. So I'm certainly no friend of the Christian fascists. I wrote a book in 2006, American Fascists, the Christian Right in the War on America. I find them frightening, and I think that they are dangerous. But until the ruling elites look and grapple with the actual root causes of what it is that propels this kind of violence, it's only going to get worse. And everything they're doing is pouring gasoline on the fire.
So, Glenn, let me speak quickly to the censorship. Isn't it stunning to you? It is to me, to see the left, most of it, 99% of it, cheering on censorship and giving power, to take away someone's freedom of speech and erase someone from today's conversation which is what they could do. I mean, they even erased Trump off of Home Shopping Network and stuff. I mean, it's like, what does that have to do? Anyway, they can just erase you. And people on the left are cheering this on. And when I stand up for this principle of freedom of speech, which you just did, people were calling us the defenders of fascists. That's what I was called on Twitter by prominent lefties. Said, why are you defending fascists? What does that make you? So what do you say to people who say, or call people like us fascists or defending fascists when we're standing up for against censorship and against unelected billionaire Silicon Valley CEOs deciding who gets to have free speech and who doesn't?
Naive. That'd be a nice word. What do they think Google, and first of all, what does Amazon have? A $600 billion contract with the CIA? I mean, these people are completely integrated into the security and surveillance state. And they were very partisan in terms of the election. They blocked the New York Post out of its own Twitter account when it published the revelations on Biden. You saw a huge effort, not just by the digital platforms, but by the New York Times. The New York Times routinely calls the John Podesta emails misinformation. It's not misinformation. Those things are valid. Nobody has ever questioned the authenticity of the Podesta emails at all. And so there's been this siloing. Matt Taibbi's done quite good work on this. There's been this siloing of the media, including the traditional media, and what they're doing is fomenting antagonisms and divisions now, which potentially can rupture the country. And I think at this point, we are going to begin to see acts of real violence by an enraged, disenfranchised white working class. And so with all of the Biden appointments, and Biden used the events last week to talk about ratcheting up internal security laws and everything else. This is just a recipe for social disintegration. It has many, many echoes of Yugoslavia, which I covered for the New York Times.
So I fear that the reaction of the Biden administration to what happened at the Capitol is going to be worse than what happened at the Capitol, and it's going to be worse for the left, and the left is cheering this on. Do you agree with that, and what do you think we should do?
Yeah. Well, we know, we take a look at what they did to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. The Democrats have a particular animus towards the real left. I mean, there is this self-identified boutique left, which is all about identity politics and multiculturalism, and these things are, if you want to call them ethical or societal issues, but they're not political issues. They're not rooted in the class struggle or economic justice or anything else. And they have a real anger towards people like you, people like Matt Taibbi, people like Glenn Greenwald, people like myself. They've already used algorithms to marginalize us. And that's not conjecture. When I was at Truthdig, before we all went on strike and got fired for trying to form a union and defend the editor, Bob Scheer, now he's founded ScheerPost, we had a graph, and it's, the impressions. So if you typed in my, imperialism, and I'd written an article about imperialism, I would come up with all the other stuff. And the referrals from impressions declined from over 700,000 in a 12-month period to below 200,000. It's probably below that now. So they've already targeted the left. They went after the left with this anonymous site, prop or not, propaganda or not, that the Washington Post put on the front page. Then we reached out to the Post to find out who they were. The Post told us, oh, we know who they are, but we can't tell you who they are. I mean, this is ridiculous. So they're giving credibility to this anonymous site that is accusing Black Agenda Report and Counterpunch and, at the time, Truthdig as being, agents of a foreign power, i.e. Russia. Therefore, they have to be marginalized. All of this predates what's happening. And essentially what you're doing is allowing Silicon Valley, these are for-profit corporations, to censor. And they'll use the outliers like Alex Jones, and I'm no friend of Alex Jones, but they'll use Alex Jones, they'll use Trump to essentially justify this control. But remember, they're doing two things. They're censoring voices, and the Democratic Party has a particular anger towards the real left because the real left calls them out for who they are, the way you do with AOC. Although I didn't expect much from AOC. AOC is turned into a creature, a political creature like all of them, totally subservient to Nancy Pelosi, who's kind of the Wicked Witch of the West. But the Democratic Party is going to be much harsher on the left than the Trump administration, because the real left is a threat to them in a way that it wasn't to Trump.
Yes, and it just right because they're gonna I'm scared. Like they're like they deranked you. So Google, what you just explained to people was Google deranked people like you. And so if you Googled imperialism, your articles used to come up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They don't come up anymore. So now people can't find your stuff. And that's called censorship. That's corporate censorship. And, I'm against censorship, whether it comes from the state, whether it comes from a corporation, or whether it comes from a church, right? That's the spirit of anti-censorship, right? And it's not technically legally, Twitter they're a private company. Now, shouldn't they be, Chris, considered a public utility?
Of course. The other thing I forgot to mention, so it's not just silencing the left, but it is funneling all viewers and readers to the established mainstream media, the New York Times, CNN. And the whole idea that these aren't partisan outlets or haven't become partisan outlets is ridiculous. The New York Times, which gave us the Iraq War, gave us 2 years of Russiagate, there was no there, gave us this horrendous, I would call it racist, Islamophobic podcast on the caliphate, which was just, there. When I worked at the Times and it had all its faults, the idea that you could run I think it was 10 or 11 part series based on an imposter, you were out. I mean, you wouldn't keep your job after that. But everything now has become siloed into catering to a particular demographic. And the Pew Research Center last summer did those polls. I'm sure you've spoken about it. I think 91% or something of the readers of the New York Times are identify as supporters of the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's 87% for NPR, 94% for MSNBC. And then, of course, the inverse with Fox, I think 95% as Republicans. But people are being broken up into competing alternative realities, because CNN and the New York Times and NBC are not concerned with truth. They're concerned with catering to that demographic. And so they can run this horrendous, and I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I'm an Arabic speaker. I mean, I smelled a rat as soon as that came out, because it played to all of the worst stereotypes of Muslims. But there's no cost for that, because they're not challenging the dominant narrative that is embraced by their audience. And it's very frightening. I mean, we're just not examining what's happening within the country and why this rage is there. And it's a legitimate rage. It may be expressed in very
crude ways,
vulgar and horrible ways, but the rage is legitimate. And if we don't go back and rebuild those social bonds, and the ruling elite that's not even in the vocabulary, nor is it in the vocabulary of the press, which is essentially stopped doing its job, we're finished. I mean, I'm very concerned. And I think that, the violence is within the DNA of American society. We're a very violent culture. We're not like Canada. I'm married to a Canadian. But it is this, going all the way back to the genocide of Native Americans and the frontier and everything else, this kind of belief of purification through violence. We're awash in, assault style weapons. So I don't think they'll get anywhere near the Capitol on inauguration. I mean, they've got 15,000 National Guard troops. But will they begin to strike out at softer targets? I mean, they came close with the governor of Michigan, the governor of Virginia. A couple of years ago, we had the pipe bombs mailed. That I think that eventually they're going to succeed. And that's what I fear, because these people legitimately, they are legitimately betrayed. That the anger towards the media outlets that rendered them invisible and never told their story, and when they speak about them, demean them and insult them. A political establishment that essentially wrote them off and consigned them to immense misery. The chattering of the self-identified liberal elites on each coast, who largely profited, the professional classes, technocratic classes, from neoliberalism, and have no real understanding of the suffering that's taken place in these post-industrial towns, which I traveled to many of them for my last book, of course. And that suffering is real. I mean, and awful. You go to town after town, boarded up churches, closed supermarkets, the opioid epidemic. People have retreated into these, self-destructive pathologies, which is always what happens with societal breakdown. And so, I salute you for calling them all out. And I'm sorry you're a lightning rod, but you're right.
Well, and everything you just described was happening before COVID.
Yes.
So now COVID, as a matter of policy, what the government has done. They've had a year to look at this. As a matter of policy, they're decimating 1/3 of the economy, and they're not doing anything to help it. So
Yeah,
they're
I mean,
just
the important thing to remember is that the problem is not just Trump's ineptitude, and he was inept. The problem is the for-profit healthcare system. We don't have an infrastructure that can cope with a national health crisis because our healthcare structure is designed only for one thing, and that's to make money. So you've consolidated and closed all these hospitals in poor communities and rural areas. The co-pays. There's no coordinated distribution plan. There's no. We don't have the infrastructure. So and that infrastructure isn't going to change under Biden because Biden is beholden to the pharmaceutical and insurance industries and Silicon Valley and Wall Street and everyone else, and that's whose interests he's going to serve, and he has always served those interests, going all the way back to when he was Senator Credit Card in Delaware.
So what?
And by the way, that big credit card, what was it? I forget
MSNB,
the name of it.
MSNBA.
Yeah. Who? Guess who they employed? His son. Hunter.
Correct. Yeah. And he said it was only for $100,000 a year or something. It was like nothing. He was trying to wave it off. It was nothing. No, Chris, I just did this thing called #ForceToVote, and we were trying to push a Medicare for All vote, which is something everybody on the squad ran on doing. And instead of what we decided that you could withhold your vote for Nancy Pelosi as speaker because she couldn't get elected without the squad. She only had like a 7-vote margin. And so they could have done it, and they didn't. They didn't do anything except give us ridiculous reasons. And what this led me to realize that there really isn't a left in America. Like they really did a good job after World War II and after the New Deal of getting that McCarthyism and getting rid of the communists. They really, really did a good job. In fact, there is no left in America.
This is Ralph Nader. I'm very close to Ralph and was actually a speechwriter when he ran. But Ralph understands corporate America, I think, probably better than any other American, has been fighting corporate power longer and with more integrity than any other American. And Ralph wrote, I think, 24 pieces of legislation, very important pieces. Remember, Ralph, by the way, organized the first Earth Day, but he wrote the Mine and Safety Act, the Clean Water Act, was instrumental in OSHA, all this kind of stuff. But he said, we got it pushed through by the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And then, especially under Clinton, with Tony Coelho and others, we saw that liberal wing decimated because they served corporate power until finally, by the time Clinton and Gore were in power, Ralph had no allies at all. He couldn't pass any piece of major consumer legislation. It was finished, and so that entire process, John Ralston Saul, the great Canadian philosopher, I think correctly calls it a corporate coup d'état in slow motion. It's over. It's finished, and Biden is going to serve the corporate state. That's why he was selected, and that's why they were never going to allow Bernie in. And then remember, all the big donors of the Democratic Party, Lloyd Blankfein, and they were all quoted by name in the New York Times, saying that if somehow Bernie was the nominee, they were all going to vote for Trump. So this whole least worst mantra, it doesn't mean anything for them. It's only used to corral us. The left is, I hesitate to use the word left because it's wrapped up in all sorts of kind of moral purity and, it's focused on, the fact, for instance, that in Biden's cabinet, you will have a certain number of women and a certain number of, that's just colonialism. I worked in the Congo, and finally, when the Belgians and the French couldn't put white faces up there, they put up Mobutu, and they killed Patrice Lumumba, who actually stood for social justice. So it's just another species of corporate colonialism, which Biden is going to do. So there'll be more women and more people of color, but they will serve the machine. And if they don't serve the machine, they're out.
And so it seems to me, it seemed to me in 2016 after Bernie dropped out, and that voting for progressives inside the Democratic Party is probably a fool's errand. And what just hashtag forced to vote just revealed is that the Justice Democrats, up until this point, right at this moment, are a failed experiment. And the Democratic Party changes you, you don't change it. And they even though they don't take corporate money, they do the bidding of the people who do. And they're all careerists, and they sell us out for their own celebrity, even if they're not selling us out for corporate donor cash. So,
yeah, that's right.
So we
And
need
if they won't sell out, then they're destroyed. I mean, their political careers are destroyed.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so we need a third party because we can't keep voting for Democrats. So what do you make of that? How do we, is that viable? People keep saying it's not viable. I think it is. The Green Party, people say they were so unorganized. They got on 46 ballots when Jill Stein was the candidate. So that's so super doable in my opinion. What do you think? I mean, how important is the creation of a strong third party to change our political system?
Well, I haven't voted for a Democrat since before 2000, and I mean, I know all of the roadblocks both parties throw up. I watched it with Ralph. It's pretty vicious, including keeping them out of the debate. If you can't raise, hundreds of millions of dollars, you have no media access, so you can draw crowds. Ralph could draw crowds of 10,000 people, but he couldn't ever speak on a televised platform. He was locked out. But I think that I think asking whether it's viable, I think they will make it very, very difficult. But I think the more important issue is that the failure on the left to stand by what it said it believed. I mean, the Democratic Party has betrayed every principle the left claims to support, which is why the self-identified left are a laughingstock. It's why they have no credibility. And Richard Rorty, in his last book, Achieving Our Country, writes about this. He said that what happens is that that hypocritical, bankrupt, spineless, self-identified left becomes hated. This happened in Weimar. It happened in Yugoslavia. And as Rorty says correctly, what takes place is that there's a wholesale revulsion towards these self-identified liberals, but more dangerously to the supposed democratic liberal values that they promote. And that is what feeds these proto-fascist movements, which we saw last week. And so the failure, I mean, we should have walked out on the Democratic Party in 1994 after NAFTA and stood by the working class. And we didn't. And they know it. And much of my family comes out of that lower working class in Maine. And I've seen their communities and lives. And I mean, where my grandparents' house was in Maine, the bank is boarded up. There was a Methodist church that caught on fire and burned. The town doesn't have the money to raise it, so it's just charred embers. I mean, there's methamphetamine labs all over the place. That's what we've done. That's what the Democratic Party has done, and the self-identified liberal class has done, and that's why they hate us. And frankly, we deserve to be hated. Well, I mean, I don't consider myself a liberal, but I totally get that hatred because they continued to speak out of both sides of their mouth. They continued to speak in that traditional feel your pain language of liberalism while putting a knife in the back of these people. And they know it. So the hatred for the Democratic Party is far fiercer because there was a time when, organized labor mattered. It doesn't matter anymore. And that was Clinton, by the way. We have two quote unquote liberal presidents, let's say, of the 20th century who were truly, truly dark figures. One was Woodrow Wilson and the other was Bill Clinton.
So I tried to make the case to people who urged me to always vote lesser of two evils. And I said, Bill Clinton was not the lesser of two evil. And they don't understand. And I try to tell them that it took a Democrat to pass NAFTA, but George Bush the first couldn't pass it. It took a Democrat blue dog to come in and give cover to the other blue dogs to go against the unions. And that's exactly what Bill Clinton and Al Gore did. And when they started the Democratic Leadership Council, which was a response to Ronald Reagan kicking their ass for 8 years. They decided to, if you can't beat them, join them. And they started the Democratic Leadership Council. And people on the executive board were right from the Koch brothers. I mean, that's who Bill Clinton turned into. He went on to gut welfare while he exploded the prison population, passed NAFTA, and then he went and he deregulated Wall Street, which led to an economic collapse within 10 years. I mean, that's the success. And they did the Telecommunications Act, which now you can't get the truth about anything.
And let's not absolve Biden. Biden was instrumental in all of that.
Yes. So my point is that they're not the lesser of two evil, right?
Well, the problem is that most of the self-identified left, and I live in Princeton, they're all, mostly liberal Democrats. They have no relationships with people who have been victimized by this system.
I know.
And so for them, it's all an abstraction. I teach in a prison. So in the early 70s, we had 300,000 people in the prison system. By the time the omnibus crime bill, which Biden pushed through, and Biden used to go around bragging that he'd increased death penalty laws, federal laws, by over 50. I mean, he used to brag about this. The whole militarization of police, that was Biden. Biden shepherded that through. So I come out of that prison. At least half my students, probably more, wouldn't even be there if it wasn't for Clinton and Biden. And the devastation that has visited on them, on their families. And remember, almost half our prison population never committed a violent crime. They're locked up. You got people, I've taught people locked up, they can't get parole. They're locked up for life on drug charges. This is ridiculous. But that's all Biden. And so when you have a relationship with people who their lives have been destroyed, how can you then go out? I mean, I also spent a lot of time in Gaza. I can't betray these people. And the fact is that the self-identified liberal class who pretends that they care about all of these issues through their money, through their support, and through their shaming of people who don't fall into line behind the Democratic Party establishment, have completely written themselves out of the political landscape. They have no relevance anymore at all, nor should they.
So what do you see going forward? I see exactly as predicted. The Democrats will be wiped out in 2022 in the House and the Senate, and then they will lose the presidency to a more competent Donald Trump, and unless they lose it to Donald Trump himself. What do you see going forward?
Yeah, Biden is like, if you go back and look at Weimar, so 1932, von Papen takes power, and he wants to bring back the ancien regime, which is exactly like Biden. He wants to recreate the Clinton-Obama era. And it's this kind of conservative utopianism, which isn't going to be achieved. So it does two things. One, it further pushes a huge segment of the population towards extremism because they feel completely locked out. Their voices are locked out by digital platforms. They're ridiculed on mainstream media. They believe, that the election was stolen from them. And the other thing that it does is seed the ground for somebody who can do this with some competence. A Tom Cotton. I mean, these are, Trump, he had the attention span of a 4-year-old. He was utterly inept. He was incapable of organization. He was, to call him a fascist. He had no real ideology. His ideological void was kind of filled by Christian fascism. But I think that, yes, I think that the trajectory as it looks from the Biden administration ensures further misery, further dislocation, especially with the economic fallout from the pandemic, which is already severe. And people, as Barbara Ehrenreich said, being part of the working poor in the United States is one long emergency. That's right. All of that's gotten much, much worse, and I think will get worse. Biden will be far more aggressive in terms of shutting down voices on the left than Trump. And there aren't many, frankly, but people like Matt Taibbi, people like Glenn Greenwald certainly will be targeted. I mean, look what happened at The Intercept. There's the perfect example of the bankruptcy of the self-identified left. I was a journalist, for most of my life. And what Glenn did was report the facts. and then when they wouldn't publish his story about the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop, you have interviewed Glenn, so you know all this. What did they do? I mean, he published the traffic, so it was incontrovertible that it was censorship. I read it. I mean, but what did Betsy Reed and all these people at The Intercept do? They went after him personally. It was really outrageous.
Yes, I know. That's right.
Respond to the facts. It was character assassination. And so I think what we'll see is, especially as things unravel, all of the Silicon Valley, which is essentially tied with the Democratic Party corporate establishment, will be used heavily against the left. I think that the divisions will grow within the country. I think the economic crisis, and who knows when we'll ever get COVID under control, I think all of these will combine to see the rise probably of somebody who, when they carry out something, this wasn't an insurrection, by the way, but when they carry out an insurrection, it'll work. They're there. I mean, there's some very malevolent political figures lurking on the fringes of the landscape, Mike Pompeo, or it may just be somebody we don't even know yet. But I think that's it. I think this is kind of, the game's over. The tragedy is that we weren't able to put, the Democratic Party would have never allow it to happen, but we weren't able to put in a figure like Sanders or others, of course. But the problem with Sanders, he'd be largely paralyzed by Congress. But to push through the kinds of radical New Deal type reforms, although is universal health care radical? I mean, every industrialized country has it.
It's radical to not have
radical.
It.
Our healthcare system is by far the most expensive, least efficient. I mean, it's just so to somehow that just shows you how pathetic the political landscape has become, that this is somehow controversial or radical type of proposal when it's just normalcy. I mean, I lived in Europe. It's how wealthy industrialized countries should work.
So what people don't realize is that if Joe Biden was a politician in almost any other Western country, he would be an extreme right winger.
Yeah, he would. I mean, the party of war, party of Wall Street.
He's against socialized medicine. That alone would send him to be an extreme right winger.
Yeah.
And people don't, and we have, he's a centrist. He's not a centrist. He's an extreme right winger. He just doesn't tweet as ugly stuff as Donald Trump. Now, let me just ask you before we let you go, people, during this hashtag forced to vote, which I was pushing, people have made the comment to me or point to me that you need to be nice to politicians to get them to do things. People, literally grown-up people, Chris, I'm not kidding, people who speak into a microphone for a living, said that you have to be nice to politicians to get them to do things for you. Is there a historical example of this working? And don't you have a story that proves the exact opposite with Henry Kissinger? And
yeah, no, that is that shows that you don't understand power or how it works. And the story, I think I told you maybe one of the times I was on your show, it comes from Kissinger's memoirs, where Kissinger's talking about being in the White House. I think it's 1971. The White House is surrounded by tens of thousands of anti-war demonstrators. Nixon has put empty city buses in a ring around the White House as a protective barrier, and he's freaking out, saying, "Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us." And that's our job, to make sure that's where politicians are. Politics is a game of fear. And the problem is, we as individuals have no power. We organized have a lot of power, and we have the capacity to make power afraid. I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. And once that crowd started booing Ceausescu, he and Elena, his wife, couldn't get to the roof fast enough to get on a helicopter. Once I covered the revolution in East Germany, Honecker sends down, the dictator of East Germany, sends down an elite paratroop division to fire on the demonstrators in Leipzig. Leipzig was the epicenter of the protests. They get there, they won't be deployed. Honecker's finished. It is a game of fear. And I think that, yes, the left is incredibly naive. I don't know about the West Coast left, but the East Coast left, they all come out of the same schools, Louis Scooter Libby went to my prep school. You know, the publisher of the New York Times went to my prep school. I was a scholarship student, but I didn't go to prep school. And it is completely incestuous. I mean, that you could hold, you know, with pretty significant numbers, reunions for Ivy League graduates within the New York Times. So they come from the same schools, they run in the same social work circles. This is especially true in Washington. They only talk to each other. They all have a kind of contempt. And I'm talking about the journalists. They all have a contempt for people who don't have their noblesse oblige and higher education and good manners and connections. So they are part of the establishment, especially if you work at the New York Times. You are part of the power elite. You know, we're going to have to make them afraid. We're going to have to organize to make them afraid, because that is the only way they will respond. And, you know, getting down on our knees, asking Joe Biden to appoint Bernie Sanders as the Secretary of Labor. I mean, I've just watched Bernie humiliate himself. I mean, since 2016, he was Schumer's bag boy. What was he, the director of outreach?
Yes.
Or, I mean, I don't, but it just meant that he got to stand in back of Schumer for photo ops. Yeah, you know, we have to begin to understand that they serve Goldman Sachs and Raytheon, and that's who they work for. Silicon Valley, Google, Facebook. I mean, look, the last part of the campaign, the airwaves were flooded with anti-Trump message. Was all paid for out of Silicon Valley, completely. You know, Biden was awash in corporate money. So, you know, the only response is to recognize that these people are not going to be reformed. They don't give a damn about what our rights are. I mean, remember that we still remain the most watched, spied upon, monitored, photographed population in human history. And when you are watched 24 hours a day by the government, you can't use the word liberty. That's the relationship of a master and a slave. That's who rules us.
There's no doubt about it. So you would even, so would you recommend, so you pressure and fear is the only thing that works on politicians. All politicians, or even like some people had make the distinction, well, you need to treat corporate Democrats one way and then you need to treat justice Democrats another way. And I said, they have to be even more afraid of their base, because there's going to be tremendous institutional pressure for them to move to the right. And we have to pressure them to move left. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, look, politicians, I'm not going to name names. I know a lot of them. Some of them I even like. But I can tell you, every time I see their number pop up on this, I know they want something. But they don't begin by saying they want something. But they don't call me unless they want something. No, it's a very strange and weird kind of human pathology that would make somebody want to go into that profession. You know, I knew George McGovern. He might have been an exception, but you know, most of them really have no ethical base. They shift. I mean, Biden has no core, no real belief system. He just, you know, he moves with whatever the currents are. Yeah, the political class throughout history has been held in check by you know, well-organized and even militant popular movements. That's just incontrovertible. And as Howard Zinn points out in The People's History of the United States, all of the opening, I mean, we built a closed system, the white slave-holding elites, by, you know, and you read the Federalist Papers, they were terrified of especially direct democracy or popular democracy. And all of the movements, the abolitionists, the suffragists, the civil rights movement, the labor movement. We had the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. Hundreds of American workers were murdered. That is what opened the democratic space. And those movements alone, if we don't recover those movements and rebuild them, and they're never going to be built within the confines of the Democratic Party, then we are going to, as we already are moving very swiftly, towards this kind of corporate totalitarianism, with the censorship imposed by, as it already is being imposed by these huge media platforms that can control the ability of literally, at this point, I guess, billions of people to communicate.
So you recently did an interview with Derek Jensen, an underknown writer and activist, and his work examines industries that you cover in your book, Unspeakable, including the cruelty of the sex industry.
Yeah.
He asked the central question: if the destruction of the natural world isn't making us happy, then why are we doing it? I mean, beyond immediate politics, are there greater questions we should be asking our culture and ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, this is a suicide, collective suicide. It's a suicidal ride, and the forces that have complete power have commodified everything. Human beings are commodities. The natural world is a commodity that it is exploiting until exhaustion or collapse. And there's a new climate report signed by several climate scientists out of Australia that everybody should go read because it's very chilling, and they just lay it bare. These people, quite literally, these people will kill us. And they will kill. They certainly will. Not just us, but they are snuffing out the possibility of the next generation. I'm not talking about, my grandchildren. I'm talking about my kids, and they have to be stopped. It's why I'm such a strong supporter of Extinction Rebellion. And the only way they're going to be stopped is if they're removed from power. And the only way they're going to be removed from power is if we rise up and force them out of power. And to keep playing their game is. Essentially to keep ourselves locked into the death march that they have organized.
Do you think Americans will rise up?
What's interesting, having covered so many revolutions and insurrections and street protests, is that the Tinder is there, but you never know what will ignite it, and you never know what it will look like when it is ignited. So I covered both of the Palestinian uprisings, the intifadas. What triggered the first intifada was a car accident. A bus or an Israeli truck hit a van full of Palestinian day workers, and people had just had enough. You can never tell what ignites it. I think the Tinder is there. I think the problem is that the left is so decimated that the backlash may be a proto-fascist right-wing backlash. That's my fear. But those people are victims too. They may speak in racist tropes and all sorts of language, and that I have spent my life fighting against. But their pain is real. Their suffering is real. Their betrayal is real. The meaninglessness that has gripped their lives is real. Their loss of hope is real. They've suffered. They've watched their families suffer. They watch their children. All of that is real. Now, it may be expressed in very negative pathologies. I mean, it is. But unless we address that suffering, unless we reintegrate these people into society, unless we reknit the social bonds to give them a place, give them a sense of dignity, give them meaning, give them a sense of purpose, we're finished. And that's what frightens me. Because both the press, the media, I turn on CNN, it's just, they can't stop insulting these people fast enough. And the Democratic Party is the same. And that is essentially precludes any possibility of ever rebuilding a healthy society.
It's like they think if they can just cancel them off enough social media apps that somehow they'll all go away.
That's it. That's what's so scary, right?
They're American.
Also the inability on their part to accept their own complicity for that suffering. There's no contrition, there's no self-reflection, there's no self-criticism, and of course there's no remorse.
Okay. Well, dark times, Chris. Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Chris Hedges, thanks for being our guest. Check out his work at sheerpost.com. That's SCHEER post.com. And of course, many of his great books. His most recent, America, the Farewell Tour. Chris, any last words, or you just want to say goodbye? I don't know. I'm going to
keep up the fight. Doing well.
All right, right back at you.
I'm with you.
Okay. Hey, everybody, this is the part where I tell you where all our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then this is why I tell you to join our premium program and get extra content, but nobody's got a fucking job. So just enjoy the video.